Kang awoke from his slumber mind already racing on plans of conquest for the day. One would think that after doing the same dance so many times, he would tire of it, but no. With every attempt, there was always something new to find and experience. Sometimes that was good, and most times bad. He wasn't sure which this one was yet. With a small stretch, he cracked his bones, limbering up as he got up from his bed, steadily making sure not to rouse her from her sleep. This was one of those things that he was sure was the first to ever happen to one of them. Usually, it was Ravana for all of them. They had fun, of course, but they always had her in the end. He had lost his when she took the blade that was destined for him during his last great battle before he was banished from their realm. The cycle usually went like that for most of them, but most had their own Ravana. Some were wiser to hide her away, but she was never one to shy away from battle, so it always ended the same. But this with Janet was new. None of the records he had accessed ever spoke about one of them being with her in all timelines. He had checked obsessively as they had fallen into this. Both trapped here with no possible way to get home, it had been a struggle at first. They had almost killed each other a couple of times before they settled in this new sort of peace. That decision that day had been the shift that had changed it all. The day she had decided to take his hand. Her brilliance had surprised him when they were working on fixing his ship. She wasn't as challenging as Ravana, always fighting for dominance, but she made her presence known when there was a need, openly challenging him when she didn't know who he was, and doing so even after she did. He found he could tolerate her. He still thought sometimes she stayed as a means to keep him in control, to keep him from fully pressing his might on this world. She runs the so-called rebels as a liberator while still remaining with him. He lets her keep them as a means for her to have some fun in this world, and he enjoys the challenge of having to see how his troops perform without the advantage of secrecy. He knows she knows that he knows, but none of them have ever openly said it. Some time ago, his men had caught one of her little toy soldiers who had become reckless after spotting them together. Well, he can say the soldier never saw the light of day again. But this here was not enough. He needed more. He needed all of them, and as much as he enjoyed their game. He needed for them to focus on what was coming if they were to survive. He knew he would be coming soon, all of him, and he wasn't going to lose her like he lost Ravana. Whether that was just his pride or something that had grown between the two of them with all this time, he wasn't sure. They had ruled over this realm for so long, but the people understood the dynamic they each represented. Janet gave up a small yawn as she opened her eyes, taking in the room before her eyes landed on him. "You are well rested. That's good. We have much to do today." Janet stared at him for a moment, letting out a sigh as she climbed out of their bed. She gave him one more look before walking past him to get herself prepared, before returning a short while later. Her robes were stunning as always, donning a white and gold gown topped with a golden crown that adorned a variety of displays from jewels to engineering marvels that instilled curiosity in him as always. She slipped her hand through his arm as they stepped out of the room. Janet sometimes caught herself in these moments when she realized just where she was and who she was with. One would say she had chosen to lay with the devil, but she saw it differently. "Conqueror! Conqueroress!" The guard team saluted as they met with them in the halls. Kang had requested them to keep a fair distance from their quarters for privacy and the ever-constant expectation of a betrayal by this week's freedom fighter. She gave them a small nod with a smile as Kang simply waved his hand and they stepped aside, allowing them to pass. The guards shadowed them as they always did as they walked through the building with ever more guards joining. Janet greeted everyone with small smiles as Kang walked forward, barely acknowledging them, with the two of them never breaking their stride. They eventually reached the observation room where his ship was on one side while the room was filled with the finest minds he could find in this underworld. Janet disentangled from his arm and moved forward to view the new data on the screens that had been collected as she heard him go about his business in the background. Janet could see the small skirmishes that Kang had warned her about starting to happen more frequently in the multiverse. She knew they didn't have long. They needed to get their forces more than ready for what was to come and get back to the real world as she thought it. She knew they needed a combined force that wouldn't falter and that always left her uneasy because of how she knew it would be achieved. "It's worrying, isn't it?" Kang said from his throne ship as he laid back observing the outside just past her. He always got like that when he talked about it. She didn't know how long he had been fighting this war. He only said after so long, time means so little. "Even if it is, we have to get more shelters ready and commissioned, especially in the lower levels, and up the guard procedure with new drills." He still found her concern for the civilians amusing sometimes, as long as it wasn't getting in the way, and of course, they adored her for that. "They have been trying to acquire the materials for your shelters and new weapons, but those rebels have been growing bolder." The message was clear as day. "You've been growing bolder." She kept her expression tight, something he knew she did when she didn't want to answer a question. "Anyhow, there are more concerning matters to us." She turned around, looking at him curiously at the small smile that adorned his face. "Murdoch said he has been detecting small pulses from the outside world." That broke the mask on her face, the outside, something she had stopped thinking about as much when she had built a life with him. She quickly schooled her features, much to his amusement. He still enjoyed seeing that mask fall. "He suspects someone might be building a machine that could interact with this world. But I await to see what he does next. This could be nothing more than an unrelated tangent, but every lead should be followed." She nodded, Janet agreed, before letting out a breath, and she looked at the surveillance feeds. "And where is Marcus?" A wider grin etched on his face as he used his gauntlet for a moment before meeting her eyes. "Currently suppressing an uprising in the North Quadrant. Trying to rush through his work, said he couldn't wait to see you again." Janet had a small smile on her face before turning to look out on their world. It still felt weird to say, but Nate had insisted. "You shouldn't send him out so much." Kang shrugged. "He asked to be deployed, and we don't have the option of letting him grow weak while the others grow stronger. And most of the time he leans towards tasks that you assign. It just so happens that my work finds him too." Janet was still proud of him for that. He didn't tend to follow his father's tendencies, but she still worried because she knew he still sought his approval. She knew the rebels were planning on making a new refuge in a location she had found for them, but she also knew Kang had his spies amongst the group, and it would only be a matter of time before he sent the main force to decimate or imprison them. If she asked nicely, he would sometimes offer mercy to those that he deemed might be useful. She had to get ready for the small trip to the outskirts that she always did every year, to her initial crash site when she first arrived in this world. At first, it had been with the hope that she would be rescued, but after many years, that had died, and now it was more of a pilgrimage. Marcus had joined her the past few years, and he would have been happy to do so on this one, but he had been called away. The rest of the day passed by uneventfully, which was always a good thing, and when evening approached, she sat on the pad with the guard awaiting to drop her off. These were Kang's most trusted with her safety, for no one should know where she went in case there was ever a plot to kill her. They would observe her from their ships and then await her return to bring her back home. Kang stood beside her as she strapped down the last of her gear. She knew he got nervous about this and even had asked her to stop this before. But she had made him understand he had his own quirks that he did, and this was one of hers. "Return quickly. There is much for us to discuss, and Marcus will be back soon." She nodded and gave him a small smile, still amused at how he would use Marcus instead of voicing what he really wanted to say, before leaning in for a kiss that, outwardly, Kang seemingly ignored, but she knew better. "I will return as fast as I can." They pressed their foreheads against each other with his arms wrapping around her in one of those rare moments he wasn't just a conqueror, but Nathaniel. They broke apart as he stepped back, brushing her hair out of her face, and stared at her with that look that was somewhat sad but expecting, as if he still expected to get the rug pulled under him, or she was taken away like the one before her. With one more final nod, he stepped back and gave a nod to the security detail, and as she boarded the ship, he once again questioned his actions. Giving himself stuff to care about was foolish, as that gave his enemies something they could use. First, it had been Janet, then Marcus, and now he worried it would all be taken away. The 7 ships all took off before speeding off at great speed. While they were exiled here, maybe he could breathe a moment of relief. Maybe this cage would have its uses. Janet arrived at the site of the start of her journey, looking around as some of the security detail made a base camp while the others waited in the ships to watch her. She had been annoyed with it at first when Kang had insisted on them, but there had been a few close calls that had her glad that he was overly protective, although she does think to this day some of those attacks were orchestrated by him. She let out a huff as she began to set off with a sled in tow with supplies behind her. One would question why she would do this if she was so revered in this realm at this point, but she just wanted something simply after having to go months with political maneuvering, which she begrudgingly preferred than Kang's, "I will shoot, then we sort through the pieces." Luckily, he had left that mostly to her as he found it tiresome, although he would join her sometimes saying it's part of a conquer, but she knew he would rather be in the field than talking to kiss-asses. The journey was going well, and it had been a few hours of just letting her mind wander as she looked at the scenes around her. This world, even if they were trapped here, never stopped amazing her with its beauty. She slowed for a moment, taking in the sights before she set off again. It was nightfall when she eventually decided to make camp. She settled down, eating her meal reminiscent of what she had when she first set off. Her security detail was in the distance, and she could spot them thanks to some tech upgrades Kang had made for her. She gave her gear another check before she went to sleep, ready for another leg of the journey. She set off in the early hours of the new day, glad that at least this area had a dash of normality of a day and night cycle, since she knew of many others that were stuck in eternal fire or eternal darkness. She was always thankful she hadn't landed in one of those areas because she knew of the monsters that lurked in each. Janet walked for many hours at a staggering pace, and she could tell that she would be upon her initial crash site soon. She had been walking much faster, expanding more energy than she had previously, because she wanted to get back before Marcus arrived to welcome him home. A storm had started to brew a few hours ago, but it wasn't anything that was surprising to her, and her security detail held steady. But it just kept growing and growing and growing, till she could barely see 2 steps ahead of her, even with her goggles on. She had seen some of the ships accompanying her struggle in the storm before one had disappeared in the darkness. Janet knew that she had to get somewhere safe. Their scanners were probably going haywire since they couldn't detect her. Something she had discovered when the rebels had used storms to escape from pursuits. She knew she had to get to shelter soon, or at least set up a shield dome. Till a blinding light appeared before her, and for a moment she thought it was her security detail somehow managing to find her in the storm. But when 2 figures stepped out of the odd-looking ship, she took a momentary step back. They stepped forward, with one telling the other to stay back as he approached, and the face she could see appear out of the dust storm caused her blood to freeze. "Hank?" "Come on, Janet! We don't have long.